Hillel, so many events have happened here in the Middle East over recent months. From my perspective as an auditor, I need to understand the events and, more importantly, how they may impact on the work that we do. What can you tell us about what's driving these events and, more importantly, how they may impact on companies and their activities?
Well, Ari, I think when you look at the Middle East and you look at Tunisia and Egypt, Syria, Bahrain, it's easy to try to think from a Western perspective or from the US perspective of just trying to generalize what's really happening here. And in fact, any expert from here in the Middle East will tell you that you can't generalize, that none of the statistics that we think about line up. At the same time, I think we can't help ourselves. I mean, we love numbers and we love statistics, so let's look at some. I mean, I think one factor that's a very simple one is youth. 45% of the population of Yemen is under 14. 33% in Egypt. 36% in Syria. So a huge percentage of the population is young. Now you have economies that are growing, but when they're so heavily dependent on oil, 30, 40%, 45% dependent on oil, you wonder whether all these people can get jobs. And you start asking yourself, well, what's happening there? And you start going further. And you understand that, 21% of the population, I mean, it's an enormous number, an enormous change. 21% of the population in Yemen between 1999 and 2009 moved from the countryside into the city.
So these are trends that are just starting, and we're going to see these taking us into the future. But more importantly, how are they impacting, or let's put it this way, why do we care? I mean, it's an interesting information, but why do we care?
Okay, so why do we care is one major factor, and that's oil. And there are two underlying things that go on underneath that whole question of why do we care. Firstly, the world, and the Western world particularly, likes stability, likes the knowledge of how much oil there is, who is going to deliver it, and when it's going to deliver. It's such a lifeblood of our entire economy. When oil prices go up, okay, GDP goes down. And that's been proven time and time again in 3 or 4 oil shocks since the 1950s. Every time oil prices go up dramatically, GDP goes down. The rule of thumb, okay, $10 increase in oil, 1/4 of a point on GDP going down. And when you have a population of the world growing at 3%, you can't have GDP growing by much less than 3%. Otherwise, essentially, our children are getting poorer. And when our children are getting poorer, our governments are unstable. It's impossible to address and think about what's happening in the Middle East without addressing the Facebook effect, the Facebook phenomenon, social media. But I think it's worth taking half a step backwards here to see what's happening behind that. Between 2005 and 2008, in the United States, the internet penetration rate rose from 70% to 76%. A reasonable rise. But in Bahrain, it went from 21% to 52%. In Syria, from 6% to 17%. In Tunisia, from 10 to 27%. These countries experienced 3x growth in the exposure to the internet. And when you understand that these countries are highly controlled by the media, the press, the TV stations, and you open that up into the huge population, a young, early adopters, urbanizing population, you create a perfect storm for a huge potential for political unrest.
Well, moving more to a micro perspective, clearly increase in cost will impact the company's bottom line. It will increase the way the financial statements look. They may start to look differently than what we've experienced. But how are companies addressing, how are they responding to this situation, or are they responding to this situation?
Airlines are hugely impacted by oil. $1 increase in oil costs $1.6 billion for the airlines. So what are they doing about it? Well, there are a number of things they're doing about it. Firstly, operationally, they're changing the way they do their business. Southwest announced that they saved 8% on fuel. That's a huge amount, 8% on fuel, simply by slowing the planes down, by flying a 2-hour flight 1 to 3 minutes longer. An amazing, amazing change. Companies are doing more hedging transactions, many more hedging transactions, and companies are holding more inventory. The whole question of just-in-time inventory, the whole question of lean manufacturing, the whole questions of how much working capital to hold is being thrown into doubt. combining what's happening with Middle East oil, with other geopolitical events, and the whole question about how we run our businesses is changing. I think that directly impacts how things work for you.
Now you're talking about things that are actually having an impact on the kind of work that we do. You've mentioned a couple of points that I think actually do relate directly to the work that we do. You mentioned hedging, for example. This may raise some issues. You may find companies that are entering into complex transactions, hedging transactions that they may have not entered into in the past. They may not have much experience with these types of transactions, which may raise issues with respect to internal controls. Do they have the necessary controls and processes in place to support their entering into such transactions and accounting for them properly? Will they be able to identify embedded derivatives if there are such components in the transactions? These are matters which, as I mentioned, clearly can impact on the internal controls as well as the financial reporting. We may be seeing things that we haven't seen in the past, and we need to understand that and to be able to address those properly from an accounting and auditing perspective.
I wonder, actually, you know, as we think about, or as you ask, now that I'm thinking about it, you think about the changes that are happening in the real live businesses. They obviously impact the financial statements as well. So even at the level of gross margin, I'd be curious for a comment about how those things are impacted.
Well, gross margin clearly is a primary indicator which comes into play, for example, when we assess analytical reviews of the results of companies. We'll compare period over period, and gross margin is a key indicator. The companies, as well as we, will need to understand what are what we're anticipating in terms of changes in gross margin in order to be able to understand and assess the reasonability of what we're seeing in forecasts. Hillel, always a pleasure. Thank you for your insights and perspectives.
It's been insights on both sides. Thank you.